So one of the things I'm curious about is what happens now when the US has made quite clear that the federal government at least has no interest in international agreements around environmental protection, around climate action. The question for me is, will other coalitions form that circumvent the US? And even more interestingly, will they be able to actually find allies within the US as well? Because the federal government is not the only actor. I mean, at the state level, at the city level, there's profound support for climate action and sustainability in the US. And I think there's profound support amongst the younger generation for those things, which is precisely why the current administration is trying to censor school textbooks and going after universities. So I'm wondering about, I think it's too optimistic to call it a moment of opportunity, but if we bear in mind that the US government has very often been an obstacle to international agreement around climate and sustainability, what happens if it's actually now quite clear that the US government is not going to work with anyone on these things? What kinds of coalitions will form? What kinds of alliances, which don't circumvent the US, but which perhaps are looking for allies at other levels of American government and society?
Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. I'm your co-host, Mike DiGirolamo. Bring you weekly conversations with experts, authors, scientists, and activists working on the front lines of conservation, shining a light on some of the most pressing issues facing our planet, and holding people in power to account. This podcast is edited on Gadigal land. Today on the newscast, I speak with Sunil Amrith, a historian and professor of history at Yale University. He is the author of the recent book, The Burning Earth, A History, which examines how humans have shaped the planet over the past 500 years, examining histories of the environment, colonization, and empire. Today, he joins me to speak about some historical precedents to the current global political moment and the recent actions of the United States government. What actions we've seen before and which ones we haven't, and what lessons from history we can learn to teach us about this situation. Amrith offers a clear-eyed perspective that fairly describes the severity and the planetary risk of continued environmental degradation at the hands of world leaders and nations. He also offers guidance on how to channel the anxiety one might feel and reminders of when and how global cooperation and peace occur. Sunil, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
So we're going to talk today about what's currently happening politically and how that compares to what has happened previously. But my first question for you is, what are some of the most significant environmental actions that have happened in this current government in the United States?
I think abrupt and severe cuts to federal funding for science, including climate science, is perhaps top of the list. I think the attack on terms like environmental justice, which has been banned by the National Endowment for Humanities, is another part of what's happening. And I think the attack on the infrastructure of the federal government that has for decades enforced environmental regulations is going to have a long and lasting impact.
And there's a lot of stuff we could talk about, probably too much for us to unpack in just this podcast episode. But historically speaking, in the United States, have we been here before, do you think?
In the United States, I'm not sure we've been here, but one of the things that strikes me is when I discuss with colleagues around the world some of the current challenges, I've been struck by how many of them express a sense of recognition, a sense that we've been here before. I think there's nothing particularly new or unusual about capricious and in many ways malign government. People around the world, unfortunately, have lived under such regimes for a long time. I suppose one of the things that's different is just because of the wealth and the military power of the United States, the capacity of this administration to do harm is perhaps unprecedented.
So then let's look to history, because this is your area of expertise. Let's look to history across the globe. What are some examples that stand out to you? how do environments or people tend to fare under regimes like this?
I think in some ways what's happening now is so multifaceted that I would tend to look to quite a range of different historical parallels for different aspects of what's happening right now. So one of the things that I think is most worrying about the current administration's approach is the sheer contempt for the rest of the world, the disregard for international agreement, the language of dismissal when speaking about the United Nations, when speaking about the international architecture that was put up after the Second World War, after the horrors of the Second World War, to try to forge global cooperation. And if we want precedents for that, I think, unfortunately, we're going back to the 1930s when Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan did just that, tore up international agreements because of the perception that those international agreements were restraining their ability to exercise unilateral power. I think there are other precedents and parallels as well. I mean, in some ways, I'm also minded to think about the last period of European imperialism in Asia and Africa, where, in a sense, facing an end game, what you see is colonial powers like the British and the Dutch sort of reinforcing repression, trying to censor articulations of anti-colonial sentiment. And in ways, I can see an element of that too in the particular hostility and aggression that the current administration has towards DEI, towards ideas like environmental justice.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to listen to the first few minutes of this podcast. There is much more to this interview, but if you want to hear the full conversation, find the Mongabay Newscast wherever you get your podcasts from and click subscribe. You can also get each new episode straight to your inbox by subscribing to Mongabay's weekly newsletter at mongabay.com. And if you really want to support us, you can donate to us at patreon.com/Mongabay. Don't forget to leave a review, and thank you as always for listening.